Wel, jeg er glad for at være her I kveld, men jeg snakker lidt norsk, so the rest is in English. I hope you can hear me okay. And yeah, and thanks very much for the chance to speak tonight. My own background is probably a bit relevant to this, I guess. My parents on my mother's side come from Caithness, and in fact, a small island called Stroma, which sits in the Pentland Firth. All the folk from Caithness think they're basically Norwegian. My mum was no exception. I thought it was quite normal to have a family where you had a grandfather, an uncle, and a cousin called Magnus in Scotland, but it's not normal. We were unusual, and I drank that in. So already with that kind of Norway tilt in my mind, I then did another pretty unusual thing, which was to have a hut. Now, I'm going to try and open this PowerPoint. You're always a bit scared at this point that something won't work. Can someone just nod to tell me that you're seeing it all right? Yes, you are. Good. So anyway, this book is kind of the product of quite a number of years, which began here. Now, this isn't a great photograph, but this was back in the 1990s. And it's funny how much, you know, selfies and the business of taking pictures of yourself is a totally modern phenomenon. When I had this, obviously not a hut, but actually an old shepherd's bothy, 1,200 feet up the side of a hill in a glen called GLENBUCHAT, which generally no one has ever heard of, which is fine, in Aberdeenshire. I wasn't taking pictures of myself, I was just living. So unfortunately now there's very little to go back on except these occasional pictures. I mean, you can see this is very high. In fact, this was a very fertile glen. It has limestone deposits that meant that actually the fields were fertile till really quite a high level, as you can see, 1,200 foot there. And so this was a shepherd's house, abandoned in the 1950s and 60s as farming in Scotland changed and outlying cottages were basically abandoned. There's a bit of a story to my stumbling across it. I was posted by the BBC to work in Aberdeen. I decided not to live in Aberdeen and looked for a house that would have a phone. And this was in the late 1980s when there were no mobile phones. So it had to have a landline, and there was only one cottage to rent between Inverness and Aberdeen, which is a long way. There was only one cottage rentable with a phone in it. And it was in this glen. It's basically down the bottom of that hill there. So I worked for 3 months there and kept glimpsing this hut up at the top. Waited till a hogmanay and the boyfriend at the time, the two of us stuttered up the hill looking for this place, found it. It looked completely abandoned, but knocked on the door. And to, I think, the horror of all concerned, the door opened and there was a professor of anthropology from Edinburgh University inside, as you do, who'd been renting it for 5 years. And of course, very low key, lots of candles, no electricity, no running water, no facilities whatsoever, outside toilet, and therefore you couldn't see any lights on in it from the road. So thinking quickly, we produced a half bottle of whiskey, said, "Happy New Year," and pretended we were first footing. That seemed to go well enough. And we had a fantastic night there, the sort of night you don't get in Scotland much. And I just feed in at this point that land in Scotland has got the most concentrated ownership pattern in the developed world. So people don't get out much, not like this. And so it was a marvelous night. We sat talking about all sorts of things as the wind and the weather and the snow swirled round us. Can't quite remember getting down the hill, but that's what a couple of drams does for you. And I remembered that, but also Alan remembered me. So when he finally stopped renting this hut, he got in touch with me at the BBC and said, "Look, come on, you were basically scouting that place. Do you want to take it on? Because it'll fall to pieces if somebody doesn't." So I thought, well, why not? And started renting it for 7 eventful years. So that's it these days, out the steadings at the back falling to pieces. And this was the last visit I made in 2010. I want you to know 15 years after I stopped renting it, because while I rented it, that gutter would never have been like that. And I did all the sort of, not very good repairs, but myself. So that started me off because I didn't know anyone in Scotland really who had, maybe I bumped into 2 other people who had similar huts too. And all my own friends thought I was mad, particularly if they came up and discovered the kind of lack of water arrangements. I thought it was fine because there was actually a water trough at the back, which was shared with the cows. And I had a floating fridge so that all the stuff that needed to stay cold was floating around in a side of the trough they couldn't reach. I thought this was brilliant. That really horrified most of my friends, and indeed my husband-to-be, who said looking at the hut was the first time he had serious doubts about the wisdom of getting married. So I'm only saying this to try and illustrate how completely weird this idea of a kind of low maintenance, water-free, everything, electricity-free place is for most Scots. And so, you know, I felt pretty weird. And then I went to Hammerfest. Now, this also is a long story, but I was lucky to meet up with a woman who has become a very good friend, Inger-Lisa Matheson, who's on the roof there, cheerfully knocking over large lumps of snow with her grandfather-in-law, Ola Larsson. In fact, Inger-Lisa made the jumper that I'm wearing at the moment for my 60th birthday last year, and I went to her wedding 2 years before that. We've been great friends. And we were friends on instant, just the instant we met. I was curious about Hammerfest. I was on a bit of a road trip around Norway. My mother comes from Wick, which is kind of the northernmost town in Scotland. And strangely, that kind of maps you on to the northernmost of things, even though Wick is completely to the south of practically everything in Norway. So Hammerfest, the other connection, the two are looking at tidal energy, Hammerfest having got an awful lot further with its technology. So that was the reason I came to see the tidal stuff. Inger-Lisa worked for them. She met me on a day off, which I began to understand is very unusual for Norwegians, and mentioned that they had huts. Huts? I was fascinated and really wanted to go and see them. On that first trip, we didn't get there because there wasn't enough time. But I met the rest of the family, and I discovered some things later. Very quickly, this is one of the family hut, the main hut at Skidi, which is kind of a meeting of roads where generally you can't get much further in the winter. One thing that always struck me about this idea that that home is where the hut is, and that the second home is actually, well, the hut is the permanent home for many Norwegians emotionally, is where the dogs are buried. I mean, you might change your first home many times in your life, according to your job or how many bairns you have, but you're not going to change your hut. And that's the place that this little grotto to the dogs of the family proved it. I was also struck by how, well, you spend your entire life at Skidi on a snowmobile going around visiting people who all live next door to each other in Hammerfest, which I thought was kind of interesting. This guy, Ove Hode, he has a very modest hut. I mean, look at the surroundings. All of you from Norway will recognize that very traditional look with the patchwork quilt, the dog, and the traditional bottle of Nescafe Gold blend. But he is also building beside it this extraordinary new hut that actually might disturb some people. It's so big. But he's a glazier. He has helped everybody else around there build their huts. And of course, with Dugnad, they have come to help him build his super big hut. So I haven't been back since this was built, but by gum, this is going to be some hut. All of this I found just completely fascinating because I thought, you know, if I'd been Norwegian, I would be normal. And that prompted me to get very interested about huts in the rest of the country. I got so interested, I sort of got formally interested and started doing a PhD jointly supervised in Oslo and Strathclyde universities. I was looking for a focus and found it on Linoya because this hutting community on the island in the middle of, let's get a picture, in the middle of Inner Oslo Fjord, the huts here began the very same year as CARBETH in Scotland, which is the largest remaining hutting site in Scotland. It's very close. It's very close to Glasgow in the same way that Linoya is just 10 or 15 minutes by ferry from Oslo. So I thought this is too much of a coincidence. And then the PhD basically compared the two, and the Huts book is pretty much based on much of that. with a lot of the adventure stories and nonsense thrown back in. So I spent a lot of time coming to these islands and sifting through their history. And I thought actually that I would read a wee bit from the book, since this is, after all, about a book, and see if I can manage to make this work, because the picture should actually just follow it through. So this was really my first trip out to the islands. Stupidly, in January, I hadn't really quite got the rhythm of island life at that point. The boat turned up as timetabled, and within minutes I was gliding towards Linoya, the only snag pretty much no one else was. I was finding out the hard way that hutting on the Huta Islands is strictly seasonal, May till October by law, and the trip offered only tantalizing glimpses of brightly coloured, snow-topped and evidently empty wooden huts with no openings for comradely chat. Frustrating. There was also no queue for the number 60 bus back into Oslo. Hardly anyone was waiting in the snow, except a young couple with their daughter clutching skis and ski poles, plus overflowing shopping bags and one large black bin bag. The bus wheeled into the turning. Sorry, somebody must maybe have their microphone. I hope this isn't me, but there's a little bit of interference. Is anyone else hearing that? Right, I can't see or hear anybody, so I don't know. Okay, let's just assume that was all right.
You should be fine now.
Okay, the bus wheeled into the turning circle and the doors swung open. It was my only chance to connect. Would you like a hand with the bag? Yes, thanks. Can you take the ski poles? There was no note of surprise in Maria's voice, like she got offers of help from total strangers every day. I wondered how bold I could be, given the low odds of meeting any other Huta dwellers from Linoya till the summer. Very. Were you on the ferry from the islands? I knew she was. Yes, were you over there too? Her English was almost perfect. I'd been on the top deck of the boat for half an hour in the biting cold. Despite all my thermal gear, my chin was frozen solid and I didn't have the energy to be evasive. Yes, I was upstairs taking photos. I'm actually doing research on huts because in Scotland, we don't really have them. Really? We have a Huta over there. Well, it belongs to my father. Well, to his new wife. Well, to her father, really. You can email me about it if you like. I glowed involuntarily with all the delicate, hesitant excitement of someone who had just been propositioned. If only I could find a pen and get my frozen hand to work, to write down their email address before they got off the bus. Maria's partner scrambled in his pocket. Here's a pen. I'm Frederick. Hi, I'm Lesley. This was quite surreal. I scribbled down their email addresses and sighed with relief when their details were safely transcribed on the back of a receipt in large frozen baby writing. They started scrambling from their bags at the National Theatre stop in the city centre. What next? Would you like to come for a coffee? We're meeting friends. And just like that, my afternoon and Frederick's hutting experience began to unfurl. Linoya, you don't pronounce the D obviously, was first camped on by working people from Oslo from the 1909 onwards. In 1922, the authorities allowed them to build huts roughly the size of their tents. As a result, most these days are just one large room. There's no running water in winter, the pipes have to be drained to avoid ice damage, and the hardy arrive only boiling snow for water. The majority of hutters, Frederick says, have always been working class socialists from Oslo, and many are still printmakers. The island is only 1 mile by half a mile. People pick mushrooms in the summer and get involved in all sorts of communal events like swimming galas. Frederick, a poet, goes out to write and stays inside the cabin without socializing, which is absolutely not what you're meant to do, he confides. Even a hut lover like myself can't quite see how anyone can find seclusion on a tiny island with 300 huts, especially at the height of summer when everyone's outdoors along with friends and extended families. Yes, that's why I use other huts as well. Frederick recounts a stay in his own Huta, a very basic house on the south coast on an island 5 hours travel from Oslo. This is more like it. He says, an old local man asked how long I planned to stay. It was October, and I said I would stay till my birthday in July. He said if I survived January, he would bake me some bread. On the first day of February, there was a nail hammered into the door with a bag containing 2 loaves. Hardy is hard for in Norwegian, and it's not so different a word from the English. But Norwegian hardiness runs on fairly epic lines compared to our own, and that's what makes their hytter culture so fascinating. Despite the Norwegian willingness to cross-country ski in sub-zero temperatures just because it's Sunday, most Norwegians are relatively soft when it comes to their hytter. Not for them the makeshift water trough shared with cows, the telegraph pole pushed into the fire, or indeed any open fire at all, too wasteful of heat compared to log-burning stoves. Norwegian hytter are generally reachable and function properly because in subarctic climes they must, and because they mostly accommodate families with children, not eccentric loners, though before any complaint, there are a fair few of them as well. A university professor once told me a hytter helped rescue the relationship with his children after divorce. I bought the hytter deliberately to win back my kids. They came every summer for the whole 6 weeks. Did they like that or just come out of obligation? I asked them recently. They said the hytter gave them a normal childhood. For a guilty, absent dad, you can't imagine how important that was to hear. My daughter learned to swim down at the beach there. I could leave her even when she was 7 because there were so many other teenage girls around. She loved it. It was unbelievably beautiful. The hut is basic. We have to walk or ski up for half an hour. That's the trouble with these new fancy hytter. They may have roads up, but if they dip, the cars get stuck. It's easier to use the old paths and just carry everything up. I thought that is true enough. Eventually, I did the same at Drumnagaro, humping everything up the hill with a stoic donkeyness only I would ever appreciate. So, will you come back to Linoya in the summer? Maria brought me back to earth with a bang. Of course. Then you must visit Tuta Norman. She knows everything about the island. Say Holger's daughter sent you. Take our map. She's in hut number 280. So I hope you're still with me, folks. That was me kind of basically just by the look of the Irish, actually, and talkativeness on Linoya and talking through to everybody about the history of those islands. So having a bit of that, I went back home and looked at CARBETH, and the similarities and then differences are quite striking. Here's a picture of CARBETH, 12 miles north of Glasgow in about, that must be about 1912. And it's got the same pattern as Linoya of having both camps and huts. And actually, for any of you Welsh folk, that also, I think, picks up the pattern at Holtzfield in the Gower Peninsula, which had a similar sort of pattern of tents to huts. And CARBETH also gained a lot of huts during the Blitz because lots of Clydebank people were evacuated there. The main reason that any of this happened is this gallus man, and maybe you folk outside Scotland don't understand the word gallus, but here William Ferris is an embodiment of it. It means kind of, oh, what does it mean? Sort of stubborn, just somebody who just, well, look at him, confident and outgoing. But William Ferris, he was born in 1897. He was one of 11 children, only 2 of whom reached the age of 5. This was a family born in Govan, the shipbuilding area of Glasgow. Poverty, huge. And yet he grew up mostly through a lot of socialist organizations that were on the go at the time, particularly in the west of Scotland, but very likely in Wales as well. The socialist Sunday school movement, which was enormous in Scotland, so big that when Paul Robeson came to sing here in 1960, an enormous park, Queen's Park, was full of all the socialist Sunday school branches that still existed in Scotland, the first being set up in 1892. He went to one of these when he was young. It taught him a lot of respect for other people and a pretty good conceit of himself. But absolutely not bending to anyone, be they a landowner or someone with a title. And this stood him in very good stead. Here he is pictured beside CARBETH Pool because he really was instrumental in getting that all going. This is him at a later age. He loved walking, he loved the outdoors, and he made a huge contribution really to Scottish society. He set up such an extraordinary list of different organisations: the Scottish Camping and Caravanning Club, the Scottish Rights of Way Society, the Scottish Ramblers Federation, and he also started the first youth hostel in Britain, not just Scotland, near Loch Lomond. And yet, generally speaking, in Scotland, no one has heard of this man. I was lucky to stumble across his son. It took me quite a while to find him, 5 days before he left Scotland for good. And the only reason I have all this is because, again, luckily, I managed to find him and speak to him. This is the story of how the development at CARBETH so nearly failed. William Ferris was in the Highland Cycling Battalion, which during the First World War was instrumental in doing signals and also communications between the lines during the war. That was a cyclist job. He was a mad keen cyclist, partly because he'd been involved in the Clarion movement, another socialist movement, which had all sorts of different aspects to it. He was a very keen Clarion cyclist, but he was also involved in the Clarion Players that went on to found the Citizens Theatre, one of Glasgow's oldest theatres. But anyway, back to the story. There he was in the Highland Cycling Battalion, stationed in Dublin, near Dublin, towards the end of the war. And he and 4 other friends had been saving money throughout the war with one single aim, and that was to manage to buy a hut in CARBETH to return to for something better, a better kind of life than they had before the war. Before that, they had gone camping. Now they just wanted to have a bit more of a toehold. So he cleverly got his commanding officer to write to the landowner of CARBETH, Alan Barnes Graham, understanding how class worked and still works, in that an officer was a better approach than a mere man like himself. And he described the war effort that he and his colleagues had made. I mean, the odds were such that it was extraordinary that all of them were still alive, and they were refused. Now, we don't have the letter that was sent back, but this one that follows after being demobbed gives the clue. You see highlighted there that one of the neighbours apparently was worried about a few bolshies being on the land. Now, think about the time. This is 1919. It's after the Russian Revolution. It's after the general strike in George Square that many people thought would spark a revolution in Scotland. It's after huge changes to the British budget that brought in massive taxation on landowners and looked for a while in Scotland likely to change the face of the great sporting estates forever. About a quarter of all land in Scotland changed hands in 3 years, from 1918 to 1921, as a product of 40% death duties. At the time, everyone thought this old style land ownership was over, but it wasn't. The landowners consolidated themselves, the foot came off the pedal, the taxes finally went, and the pattern that we have today still remains. So, nothing daunted, William Ferris just decided to turn up and start camping, and he did, like many other people did. They just went for it. And he struck up a friendship with Alan Barnes Graham, very improbable perhaps, but the two of them clearly struck a very good friendship, because by 1922, Barnes Graham was persuaded and he said, yep, huts can happen here, but here's the deal. You, William Ferris, have to organise everything. So the fact that he spent his life pretty much doing this meant that William Ferris was the only one who didn't get a hut at CARBETH in the end, which seems terribly ironic. This is a picture, a cartoon done of him at the time, called The Optimist, which is indeed what he always was. A fairly chunky man, no lean, mean fighting machine on that bike, but a specially made bike to tackle both the hills, the gearing, and the need for lots of tents on panniers. This other cartoon is a cartoon done at almost exactly the same time of Linoya, with, you know, basically a lot of wild behavior there, which got tamed somewhat by the huts. Other comparisons, it's extraordinary. It's as if the two communities had almost got a script. They both had swimming associations, and they both live on. CARBETH only lives on because they fought. This is the pattern of what's happened with huts in Scotland, that the first generation may have a good bond between a landowner, a private landowner, and the hutters. By the time it's the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren, they don't care. That personal link has gone. The hutters, generally speaking, about 88% of them are tenants of the land, eminently evictable. By contrast, in Norway, about 88% of Norwegians own the land that their huts sit on, which just stops all this kind of insecurity that dodges huts in Scotland. They all suffered a rent increase in 1999 by the grandson. They went on rent strike for 10 years. They appealed to for help from the new Scottish Parliament and were ignored. But what saved them really was the intervention of Stirling Council, who designated every hut a conservation area, which I noticed was what Swansea Council did in 1990 with Holtsfield. So it's funny, in the end, it wasn't the Scottish Parliament, it was the local council that sort of came to the rescue. Still a stalemate for another 10 years until finally a buyout, and the amount paid by these 150 hutters means that they'll be repaying that debt until 2035. But at last, they are actually secure. You can't say the same briefly for some of the other big hutting sites that existed in Scotland. SETON Sands, like many of the original hutting sites, and the same ones down in what were known as the plot lands around Essex, around London, you see lots of old railway cars, just repurposed huts and railway cars of all kinds were the first kind of things that were on these sites. Unlike Norway, they weren't self-built, generally speaking. And again, right from the beginning, unlike Norway, these folk could be moved on at the drop of a hat. So here's SETON Sands as it was, quite picturesque, although I'll bet you that was pretty drafty in about 1920. And there is SETON Sands today. It's a long story. Again, all of these are in the book if you're interested. But basically, the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act pulled the bar so high in terms of building standards that almost every hut failed. And a nearby development that needed caravans for workmen started the business of caravans, looking simpler, basically, than huts. You could have a long conversation about makeshift things in the Scottish landscape, in the British landscape. We seem to be uniquely bothered by having things that are not perfect and are not almost twee. The huts are never going to be that because they are makeshift. They are just good enough. And that doesn't work for planning here. Finally, Barry Downs, a big site up on the east coast near me, up above Dundee between Moneyfieth and Carnoustie. This probably was the model for any of you who are interested in the Bruins. This is a cartoon set of a character family devised by DC Thompson in Dundee. That's been a huge hit for, well, almost a century. And they had a button ben that they went away to as a family, very, very likely to be Barry Downs. It was very, very modest. Look, you know, you're seeing this here. This is not going to get any prizes for aesthetic splendor, but these were built by the inhabitants and loved by them for that very reason. This is Jim Rowling, who I met, who was fighting off the same process, eviction, after the third generation of landowner. He was really instrumental in trying to fight back against rent rises, water being turned off, all sorts of things the landowner shouldn't have been able to do. But he was eventually evicted because the law is quite simple in Scotland. If you're a temporary tenant of anything, you have no tenants' rights. You have to be a permanent full-time tenant to have tenants' rights. This distinction I haven't come across in any other country at all. So they were always going to lose, and indeed they did. When they weren't there, one weekend, pretty much every window of every hut was smashed and everything inside was vandalized. Nobody reported a crime, nobody saw who did it, but that was just the state of it. And it would break your heart. This meant so much to the working class people who owned these huts. And they tried for a very long time. They tried to make the point that they were still, it was living huts, that they were still trying to kind of maintain a presence. But eventually in 2012, they were all evicted. And the next year in 2013, Jim Rowling died of a massive heart attack. Now, this is where, to me, this is just tragic, because people have poured their heart, their energies, their hopes into these little modest dwellings, things that you would look at and you say, what, really? Anyone is really valuing this? This is one of the most embattled little hutting areas at the CLOCH beside Greenock. And these are mostly ex-shipping containers where the guys have actually managed to just cut into the steel doors to let themselves just basically, you know, live in it like billets. And they sit between the high tide line and the road is right behind those huts. There's nothing beautiful about it, nothing to me. To the guys who live there, who have very, very low incomes, this is their lives. This is their pride and joy. And that is where we are in Scotland currently, with huts loved by people who are on the margins with no rights whatsoever and without anyone really coming to the rescue. So what have we got finally in Scotland as a result of this, of not having a place of shelter, a family inheritance in the way that our Norwegian cousins would have? We have hardy loners. Of course, people immediately say, but there's the Monroes, we're all outdoors, we're all doing, yeah, you are, but you're coming home every night. Or like Jock Nimlin here, you're living in caves to do it. Or indoor families who've just given up completely on the idea of establishing any recurrent connection with any other individual place. Here's just exactly how extreme the numbers are. And the 1991 date in this is simply because Scotland stopped counting. Everybody else has got more recent data. And there we are. You know, the Norwegians have more huts, cabins than anyone on earth that I can find. And there's Scotland in huts, only 1 per 8,000 Scots. It's just utterly rare here. The differences, we've skipped through a lot of them. And if you want to talk more about them, I'd be happy to enlarge on it. But really all the kind of useful groundwork that was done in Norway, partly as a result of widespread land ownership, partly as a result of not having nobility, of having loads of forest owners because most huts sit in forests, a sort of consensual society where people are not us versus them, and the class distinctions that exist in Scotland are sort of non-existent, and even things like an early limit to the working day and early paid holidays in 1919. Do you know that actually guaranteed holiday pay only happened in Britain in about 2000 as a result of the European Union's Working Time Directive? Up till then, every paid holiday offer was non-mandatory. And that, again, makes it really, really different to sort of hope for something extra like a hut. So we can change all this? Of course we can. But the reason I was interested in all of this is not just because of my sort of experience in huts and the connections with nature it would bring and the place it would allow Scots to go as a physical escape rather than the chemical escape that Scots tend to specialise in. That's one issue, but it highlights so many things that don't work about the distribution of land in Scotland. And I hope it just sparks an appetite, because none of this will change unless people start wanting something more than being cooped up in cities. So if you'd like to get the book, hope you would like to read it. You can buy it from me at that website. It's my website. And just for the time being, there's free postage if you use that code when you do the business. So thanks very much for listening, and delighted to answer any questions.